I want to tell you a story about a friend of mine. Let's call him Frank. I met Frank recently in Beijing. He's a graduate of Tsinghua University, which, if you don't know, is essentially the MIT of China. It's the training ground for the engineers who run the country. Frank is what you'd call a safe player. He's not a wild gambler. He's slightly doughy, soft-spoken, the kind of guy who calculates the odds before he orders lunch. Back in the mid-1990s, like so many of China's best and brightest, Frank left China. He went to the United States for graduate school because, frankly, that's where the opportunities were. China was still a factory for cheap toys and textiles. America was the future, and he lived the American dream. He worked for a leading US semiconductor firm for a decade. He bought a house with a backyard, a luxury that was unimaginable in the China of the 90s. He had 2 kids, an SUV, the works. He was content, but then he started watching his old classmates back in Beijing and Shanghai. They were launching startups. They were becoming billionaires. They were grabbing the pot of gold that the Chinese internet boom offered. So Frank decided to take a risk. He packed up his family, moved back to China, and started his own semiconductor company. And for the first few years, he was miserable. See, here is the secret that Washington, D.C. doesn't understand. The secret that gets lost in all the headlines about IP theft and forced technology transfer. For decades, Chinese companies did not want to buy Chinese technology. I've advised some of the largest companies in the world, and I saw this dynamic in boardrooms every single day. If you were a purchasing manager at a Chinese tech giant, let's say a company like Alibaba or Tencent or even Huawei, you had a choice. You could buy a chip from Frank's startup, which was okay, it was cheap, it worked, but it wasn't the best. Or you could buy a chip from NVIDIA or Intel or Qualcomm. What did they choose? They chose the American chip every single time. Why? Because it was safe. It's the old adage, nobody gets fired for buying IBM. If a Huawei engineer bought an American chip and the server crashed, he could shrug and say, hey, I bought the best in the world. It's not my fault. But if he bought Frank's chip and it crashed, he's fired. He bought the cheap domestic junk. So Frank was starving. He was scratching out a living, selling to low-end manufacturers who just wanted the cheapest option. The big dogs, the companies that actually mattered, wouldn't take his calls. They were addicted to American technology. They loved it. They trusted it. The United States had total dominance over the Chinese technology stack. America held the leverage. As long as Chinese companies were happily sending billions of dollars to Silicon Valley to buy the best chips, China's domestic semiconductor industry was stuck in the minor leagues. It was structurally constrained and under-incentivized. It had no reason to innovate because it was easier to just write a check to California. And then Donald Trump and Joe Biden changed everything. They tried to kill China's tech sector, but instead they did the one thing Frank couldn't do for himself. They gave him a customer. Before we go further, let me be clear. Frank's story isn't about one company or one man. It reflects patterns I've observed across many firms in China. Not a guaranteed outcome, but a structural shift in incentives. It started with the trade war, but it escalated quickly into a tech war. The United States government, driven by war hawks in Washington, decided that China's rise was no longer just an economic challenge. It was a national security threat. They looked at companies like Huawei, which had become the largest telecommunications equipment maker in the world, and they didn't see a business success story. They saw a weapon. So they dropped the hammer, they put Huawei and then dozens of other Chinese tech firms on the entity list. Now, you have to understand what this meant on the ground. I was in China when this happened. The atmosphere shifted overnight. Suddenly, American companies, the Intels, the Googles, the Qualcomms, were banned from selling their advanced technology to their biggest Chinese clients. For a company like Huawei, this was supposed to be a death sentence. Without Google's Android operating system, their smartphone sales outside China plummeted. Without American 5G chips, their base stations were supposed to turn into expensive paperweights. The logic in Washington was simple. We control the choke points. If we cut them off, they die. But let's go back to Frank. Frank told me that the day the sanctions hit, his phone started ringing. And it didn't stop. The same procurement managers who wouldn't give him the time of day for 5 years were suddenly begging for meetings. They were desperate. They said, "Frank, we need everything you have. We don't care if it's not as fast as the American version. We don't care if it's 20% more expensive. We need it, and we need it now." Why? Because the calculation of risk had fundamentally flipped. Before the sanctions, the risk was performance. The risk was that the Chinese chip might fail. After the sanctions, the risk was survival. The risk was that the American supply chain could be turned off by a signature on a piece of paper in the White House. I spoke to executives at Huawei during this time. They realized they had been naive. They had built their empire on a foundation of American sand. They thought commerce would trump politics. When that illusion shattered, they went into survival mode. They scrubbed their supply chains. If a component was made in America, it was a liability. If it was made in China, it was an asset. Frank's business boomed. He told me, "Sean, we can't keep up with the orders. Our factories are running 24/7. And here is the critical part. It wasn't just that he was selling more chips. It was that he was suddenly flooded with cash and data. In the tech world, volume is everything. Because Chinese giants were forced to buy Frank's good enough chips, Frank suddenly had the revenue to invest in R&D. He could hire better engineers. He could upgrade his equipment. He told me, "Even if our technology isn't as good as the Americans right now, it doesn't matter. They rely on us to provide a steady supply, and we are improving. We will catch up." By trying to starve the Chinese dragon, the US government inadvertently started feeding it. They sharply reduced foreign competition in critical segments and left the goal wide open for Frank. This brings us to a concept that you need to understand if you want to know where the global economy is heading. It's a phrase that is pasted on the walls of every government office and boardroom in Beijing. Indigenous innovation, or in Mandarin, Zizhu Chuangxin. For years, this was just a slogan. It was a nice idea. But as I said, as long as it was cheaper to buy American, indigenous innovation was a pipe dream. But the sanctions created a Sputnik moment for China. The government realized that they could no longer rely on the global supply chain. They had to own the core technology. They had to control the hard tech, semiconductors, batteries, advanced materials. Washington often looks at China through the lens of the Soviet Union, a rigid, state-run monolith that can't innovate. Or they look at it through the lens of Japan in the 1980s. Do you remember the 1980s? Japan was the rising superpower. Toshiba was the boogeyman. They were crushing American manufacturing. So the US crushed them back. They slapped tariffs on Toshiba. They forced Japan to sign the Plaza Accord, skyrocketing the value of the yen and making Japanese exports too expensive. Japan blinked. They capitulated. And they entered 3 decades of economic stagnation. Beijing has studied that history book very, very carefully. They know exactly what happened to Toshiba. And their conclusion is simple. We will not be Japan. China is not occupied by American troops. It does not rely on the US for its national security. And frankly, the leadership in Beijing today, men who grew up during the Cultural Revolution, who learned survival the hard way, they are not wired to back down. So instead of folding, they doubled down. The government poured billions of dollars into little giant funds, specifically targeting companies like Frank's. They told the state-owned enterprises, "You must buy local." And we are already seeing the results. Look at the Huawei Mate 60 Pro. When this phone was released in 2023, it shocked the Washington establishment. The US Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, was actually visiting China when it launched. It was quite the statement. Why was it a shock? Because it was powered by a 7-nanometer chip made in China by a company called SMIC. The sanctions were designed to slow China's advance at this node. The US had banned the export of the lithography machines needed to produce it. They thought they had frozen China in time, stuck at 14 nanometer or 28 nanometer technology. But technology doesn't stand still. When you back a cornered animal, it fights. SMIC and Huawei engineered a workaround. Is it as efficient as what TSMC does in Taiwan? Probably not yet. Is it expensive? Sure. But does it work? Yes. This is the Frank effect at scale. The sanctions forced Huawei to become vertically integrated. Before, Huawei was a client of NVIDIA. Now, Huawei is emerging as a domestic and geopolitically aligned alternative. They are designing their own AI chips. They are building their own operating systems. The US wanted to kill a rival. Instead, they significantly reduced their vulnerability to American leverage. So, where does this leave us? What is the end game of Frank's story? Well, Frank is doing great. He's preparing to take his company public on the A-share market in China. He's going to be a wealthy man. He's hiring the best engineers from Tsinghua who 10 years ago would have gone to work for Microsoft or Google. But what about the American companies? I spoke to a senior executive at a major US tech firm recently. He was despondent. He told me, Sean, we are losing our biggest market and we are creating our biggest future competitor. You see, the semiconductor industry relies on scale. You need massive revenue to fund the massive R&D costs to build the next generation of chips. For years, sales to China provided that revenue. China bought 30% to 40% of the output of major US chip firms. That money is now gone. And worse, that money is now flowing into the pockets of Frank and SMIC and Huawei. We are effectively funding our own displacement. We are entering a world of two distinct technology spheres. There is the split. On one side, you have the US and its close allies, the G7, using the American tech stack. On the other side, you have China. But it's not just China. It's the global South. It's Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Brazil, Africa. I travel to these places constantly. And what I see is that they are increasingly looking at American technology with suspicion. They saw what the US did to Russia, freezing their central bank reserves. They saw what the US did to Huawei, cutting off their chips. And they are thinking, if we cross Washington, could they do that to us? So, they are diversifying. They are buying Chinese tech. It's good enough. It's cheaper. And it comes with fewer overt conditionalities than Western alternatives. Frank's story is a warning. It's a lesson in the law of unintended consequences. The United States thought it could contain China by cutting off the flow of technology. It assumed that Chinese innovation was nothing but a copycat machine that would grind to a halt without American inputs. That was a fatal miscalculation. The days of easy profits in China for Western tech firms are over. The golden age is gone. But China didn't collapse. It pivoted. It went from import innovation to indigenous innovation. And the irony is, 50 years from now, when historians look back at how China became a semiconductor superpower, they might point to the sanctions as the spark that started the fire. They might realize that by trying to destroy Huawei, the United States actually saved it.
Europe seized $105 billion from Russia to fund Ukraine. Russia nationalized $120 billion in European corporate assets. Siemens, Volkswagen, Shell, 30 years of investment, gone. And that was just the opening move. I want to show you how Europe just committed one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders in modern economic history. Not because the idea was wrong in principle, but because they fundamentally misunderstood who had more to lose. They thought they were wielding a financial weapon. Instead, they handed Russia a roadmap for destroying European economic credibility. And Russia didn't just follow the roadmap, they improved it. Let me take you back to February 2024. Brussels was under enormous pressure. The war in Ukraine was grinding through its third year. Ukraine needed money. European voters were growing tired of writing checks. And someone in Brussels had what seemed like a brilliant idea: Russia has $105 billion in assets frozen in European financial institutions, central bank reserves, sovereign wealth fund holdings, investment accounts, just sitting there. Why not seize them, use them to fund Ukraine, punish Russia, solve the funding problem? No domestic tax increases needed. The legal justification was creative, to put it diplomatically. Freezing assets during conflict is standard. Actually confiscating them and transferring ownership? That's unprecedented for a major economy's sovereign reserves. But European lawyers found a pathway. The announcement came in March 2024. $105 billion in Russian state assets would be seized and transferred to Ukraine for reconstruction. The initial reaction was triumphant. European leaders called it innovative economic statecraft. Financial newspapers praised the boldness. Ukraine celebrated. The narrative was simple. Russia will pay for its own war with money it can't defend. And for about 2 weeks, it looked like a masterstroke. Then Moscow responded, not with angry statements or diplomatic protests, with 3 moves so calculated, so devastating, that European finance ministers are still trying to understand what hit them. Move 1. Russia announced the nationalization of all European corporate assets on Russian territory. Not suspension of operations, not temporary seizure, permanent nationalization. The value? $120 billion, more than Europe had seized. Let me make this concrete because the human cost gets lost in aggregate numbers. Volkswagen had been operating in Russia since the 1990s. They built factories, developed supply chains, trained workers, invested billions. In some Russian cities, VW plants were the largest employers. 30 years of patient investment, thousands of jobs created, relationships built, all of it gone. The Russian government took the factories, the equipment, the intellectual property. Volkswagen's Russian subsidiary simply ceased to exist as a German company. Siemens faced the same fate. They'd installed power infrastructure across Russia, built rail systems, supplied industrial equipment. Russia didn't just take the physical assets, they took the maintenance contracts, the spare parts inventory, the service agreements. Decades of market position eliminated overnight. Shell was even worse. They had major stakes in Russian energy projects. Sakhalin-2, Arctic LNG, joint ventures with Gazprom worth tens of billions. Russia nationalized every foreign share. Shell went from equity partner to nothing without receiving a single ruble in compensation. And it wasn't just the big names. Hundreds of European companies, from mid-sized manufacturers to service providers, discovered their Russian operations had been confiscated. Danone lost dairy plants, Carlsberg lost breweries, Auchan lost retail operations. The list went on. Every European company that had invested in Russia over 3 decades woke up to find their assets belonged to someone else. The immediate corporate losses were staggering, but the strategic consequences were worse because Russia didn't keep those assets idle. They sold them to Chinese companies at massive discounts. Think about what that means. European firms spent 30 years building market share in Russia, understanding local customers, developing distribution networks, training workforces. That knowledge, that market position, it can't be rebuilt quickly. It represents competitive advantage earned through decades of patient investment. Russia handed all of it to Chinese competitors for a fraction of its real value. Volkswagen's Russian market share didn't evaporate. It transferred to Chinese automakers who bought the factories and kept producing. Shell's energy projects didn't stop. They continued under Chinese ownership. Siemens's contracts didn't get cancelled. Chinese industrial firms took them over. Europe lost 30 years of investment and market position. China gained it in months. But Russia's retaliation didn't stop with nationalization. Move 2 was subtler but potentially more damaging long-term. Russia announced that all energy exports, all commodity sales, would only be settled in rubles or yuan. No euros accepted. Period. Now, you might think this would isolate Russia from global trade. Europe assumed it would. The entire Western financial system runs on dollars and euros. If Russia rejected euros, surely their customers would refuse to deal in rubles. Surely India, China, Turkey, the major buyers of Russian energy, would demand traditional currency settlements. They didn't refuse. They quietly switched. India set up ruble-rupee payment mechanisms. China was already using yuan for Russian transactions and expanded it. Turkey created similar bilateral arrangements. Within months, Russia was conducting the majority of its international trade without touching euros. The practical implication? Europe's economic sanctions, which depended on Russia needing access to euro-denominated finance, became far less effective. The leverage evaporated, but the signal to the world was even more significant. If Russia can trade with major economies without using Western currencies, what does that say about dollar and euro dominance? What does it say about the necessity of the Western financial system? The answer was becoming uncomfortable. It's optional. Not ideal, perhaps, but absolutely optional for countries willing to create alternatives. Then came move 3, and this is the one that keeps European central bankers awake at night. Russia, together with BRICS partners, announced the creation of a $150 billion BRICS Plus reserve fund. The explicit purpose: provide seizure-proof custody for member countries' reserves. Let me explain why this matters. Central banks hold foreign reserves for trade settlement and crisis management. Traditionally, those reserves are held in dollars and euros because they're liquid, stable, and accepted everywhere. But those reserves are held in Western financial institutions, New York banks, London clearinghouses, Frankfurt accounts, which means they can be frozen or seized if Western governments decide to do so. Russia demonstrated this vulnerability. One day, your reserves are accessible. The next day, they're frozen. The day after that, they're confiscated and given to someone else. For any country watching, the lesson was terrifying. Your reserves are only yours until a Western government decides they're not. The BRICS Plus Reserve Fund offers an alternative, held outside Western jurisdiction, structured specifically to be seizure-proof, not denominated in dollars or euros. For countries worried about Western financial weaponization, it's exactly what they needed. And within weeks of the announcement, dozens of nations quietly began exploring participation. Saudi Arabia inquired about joining, not because they're anti-Western, because they have $600 billion in reserves, and they just watched $105 billion get confiscated from another major oil exporter. If it can happen to Russia, why not to them? What if a future US administration decides Saudi oil policy isn't aligned with American interests? Can they wake up one morning to find their reserves seized? Singapore, one of the world's most sophisticated financial centers, started asking the same questions. Their entire business model depends on being a safe, neutral haven for international capital. But if Western financial systems seize sovereign reserves based on political decisions, is anywhere truly safe? They began diversifying. Even Switzerland, the original neutral financial haven, faced questions. Swiss banks held some of the frozen Russian assets. The Swiss government participated in the sanctions regime. For centuries, Switzerland's value proposition was absolute neutrality and discretion. That reputation took a hit. If Switzerland freezes Russian central bank reserves, what does Swiss neutrality mean? The capital flight started almost immediately, not dramatic sell-offs that make headlines. Quiet portfolio adjustments, reserve managers in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Beijing, Singapore, they started reducing euro allocations, not to zero, but from maybe 20% of reserves to 15%, from 15% to 10%. Measured as percentages, it seems small. Measured in absolute terms, we're talking hundreds of billions moving out of euro-denominated assets. And when that much capital moves, effects ripple through the system. Euro depreciated despite European Central Bank intervention. Borrowing costs for EU governments increased as demand for their bonds softened. The spread between German bonds and US treasuries widened. These movements are subtle, but they matter. They represent the slow erosion of the euro's status as a preferred reserve currency. Let me connect what Europe actually accomplished with this $105 billion seizure. They funded Ukraine for perhaps 1 year. That's the benefit. The costs? European companies lost $120 billion in physical assets and 30 years of market position in Russia. The euro's credibility as a reserve currency was damaged. China gained massive market share in Russia at discount prices. Dozens of countries began actively seeking alternatives to Western financial systems. The strategic calculation was catastrophic. Europe assumed Russia needed access to European finance more than Europe needed Russian goodwill and market access. They were wrong. Russia has China, Russia has India, Russia has commodity exports that the world needs regardless of currency. Europe had corporations with massive sunk costs in Russia and a currency whose value depends on global trust. And here's what makes this so frustrating from an economic standpoint. The people making the decision weren't stupid. They understood finance. They knew the risks, but they made a political calculation that overrode economic logic. The domestic politics of being seen to punish Russia was more important than the long-term consequences of weaponizing financial systems. Because once you weaponize finance once, every country in the world adjusts their behavior. They don't trust your assurances that it was a special case. They don't believe you when you say their reserves are safe. They saw what happened to Russia and they prepare. This isn't about defending Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's a separate moral and political question. This is about whether the tool Europe used was smart, whether the costs were worth the benefits. And the answer, looking at the economic fallout, is clearly no. I want to be specific about the corporate devastation because these companies have names, histories, people whose lives were affected. Volkswagen's Russian operations employed 15,000 people directly. Add suppliers, and you're looking at tens of thousands of jobs. Those Russian workers didn't invade Ukraine. They assembled cars. When their German employer lost the company, they lost their jobs or were transferred to Chinese ownership. The human cost of these economic weapons isn't abstract. For Volkswagen shareholders, the write-off was massive. For Volkswagen workers in Germany, it meant reduced profitability and potentially job insecurity back home. For Volkswagen's competitive position globally, it meant losing a major market to Chinese competitors who now have the infrastructure VW built. Shell's situation was arguably worse because energy assets take decades to develop. Finding reserves, negotiating agreements, building extraction infrastructure, you can't replace that quickly. Shell didn't just lose profit streams. They lost future production they'd planned business strategy around. And those reserves didn't disappear. They're still being extracted, just by Chinese companies now. The irony is that this was entirely predictable. When you seize someone's assets, they seize yours. It's not complex strategy, it's basic reciprocity. But European decision-makers seemed genuinely surprised by Russia's response, as if they expected Russia to accept $105 billion in losses without retaliation. This reveals something troubling about European strategic thinking. They'd become so accustomed to dealing with countries that couldn't retaliate effectively that they forgot what happens when you fight someone who can hit back. Russia isn't a small economy dependent on Western goodwill. It's a major commodity exporter with powerful friends. It had options. Europe seems to have forgotten that. The geopolitical realignment this triggered is still unfolding. The BRICS Plus Reserve Fund isn't just about reserves. It's about creating parallel financial infrastructure outside Western control. Payment systems, clearing mechanisms, credit arrangements. Every piece of infrastructure reduces dependence on Western systems. China emerged as the massive winner in all of this. They gained corporate assets in Russia at discounts. They positioned the yuan as an alternative settlement currency. They lead the BRICS Plus initiatives that dozens of countries are now joining. The Belt and Road Initiative just got an enormous boost because China can now offer financial alternatives to countries worried about Western sanctions. And the timing couldn't be worse for Europe. Europe is already struggling with energy costs post-Ukraine war. Industrial competitiveness is declining. Germany, Europe's economic engine, is facing potential deindustrialization. And now, on top of all that, European companies just lost a massive market, and European finance lost credibility as a safe haven. The lesson the world learned wasn't the one Europe intended to teach. Europe wanted to demonstrate that invading neighbors has economic consequences. What the world actually learned was that holding reserves in Western financial systems exposes you to politically motivated confiscation. Those are very different lessons. Saudi Arabia is now negotiating oil sales in yuan. That was unthinkable 5 years ago. The petrodollar system, where oil globally was priced in dollars, was a cornerstone of dollar dominance. If oil transactions move to other currencies, dollar demand decreases, dollar value decreases, US borrowing costs increase. Europe's asset seizure didn't just hurt the euro, it's contributing to the slow erosion of the entire Western financial architecture. The strategic blunder wasn't seizing Russian assets per se. It was doing it without considering second-order effects, without asking what Russia would do in response, without modeling how other countries would react, without considering whether $105 billion in short-term funding was worth permanent damage to financial system credibility. This is economic policy making driven by political necessity rather than strategic thinking. And the costs are being paid not by the politicians who made the decision, but by European companies, European workers, and European financial credibility. I don't know if there was a better option available to Europe in supporting Ukraine. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe every choice was bad and this seemed least bad politically. But if this was the best option, that tells you something troubling about Europe's strategic position. That the best they could do was trigger massive corporate losses and financial system credibility damage for 1 year of Ukraine funding. The real tragedy is that this wasn't necessary. Europe could have funded Ukraine through traditional budget mechanisms, tax increases, spending cuts, bond issuance, all painful politically, but none of them would have triggered Russian retaliation or global loss of confidence in European finance. They chose the path that seemed politically easy in the short term, and it's costing them enormously in the long term. Russia didn't just respond to Europe's economic warfare, they taught a masterclass in it. And the lesson isn't for Europe alone, it's for every country watching. The era of Western financial dominance isn't ending because of Russian strength. It's ending because Western powers are demonstrating that the system can't be trusted. And dozens of countries are drawing the obvious conclusion. Build alternatives, diversify, reduce dependence. This is how empires end, not with dramatic collapse, but with steady erosion of the mechanisms that made them dominant. The $105 billion seizure will be studied for decades as a case study in strategic miscalculation. Europe thought they were punishing Russia. They were actually destroying their own credibility. Let me show you exactly how the financial infrastructure alternative is developing, because this isn't theoretical future planning. This is happening now. The SWIFT system, which handles international bank messaging and enables cross-border payments, has been the backbone of global finance for 50 years. Russia was partially cut off from SWIFT in 2022. Initially, this seemed devastating. How do you conduct international trade without SWIFT? Russia had an answer ready. SPFS, their domestic alternative, had been under development since 2014, when Crimea sanctions first threatened SWIFT access. By 2024, SPFS had over 500 participants, including banks from 20 countries. China's CIPS system, an alternative to SWIFT for yuan transactions, integrated with SPFS. Suddenly, Russia and China could conduct trade completely outside Western financial infrastructure. The volume of transactions on these alternative systems is growing exponentially. In 2022, maybe 10% of Russian international trade settled outside SWIFT. By late 2024, that figure exceeded 60%. And it's not just Russia using these alternatives. Turkish banks are connected, Indian banks are connected, Central Asian republics, Middle Eastern nations, African countries exploring connection. Why does this matter beyond Russia? Because every country that connects to alternative payment systems reduces their dependence on Western-controlled infrastructure. And that dependence was the source of Western financial power. If you need SWIFT to trade, you need Western approval. If you don't need SWIFT, Western approval becomes optional. The European Central Bank understands this threat. Internal documents show they're modeling scenarios where the euro loses 20-30% of its reserve currency share over the next decade. Less demand for euros means lower value. Lower value means higher import costs. Higher costs mean inflation or reduced consumption. European living standards decline, and there's no easy policy response. Reserve currency status isn't about interest rates or monetary policy. It's about trust. Europe broke that trust. You can't restore it with press releases. Let me walk through how capital flight works. You're a reserve manager for Saudi Central Bank. $600 billion in reserves, 20% in euros. After watching Europe seize Russian reserves, you're uncomfortable. You don't sell everything immediately. As Eurobonds mature, you reinvest 80% in euros, shift 20% to gold or yuan. Quiet. Gradual. But multiply this across dozens of central banks and sovereign wealth funds. European bond auctions become less oversubscribed. The EU needs higher yields to attract buyers. Higher yields mean higher borrowing costs. Higher costs mean either higher taxes or reduced spending. Growth slows. This is already visible. German bond yields relative to US Treasuries have widened from basically 0 to 40 to 50 basis points. On Germany's $2 trillion debt, that's billions in additional annual interest costs. The corporate sector is drawing conclusions too. If investing in certain countries exposes them to nationalization risk based on European political decisions, maybe those investments aren't worth it. Shell publicly states they'll never invest in Russia again, but they're also cautious about China, Brazil, anywhere that might face sanctions. This caution means reduced investment, reduced future revenue, reduced shareholder returns. For European workers, this means job insecurity. When employers lose major markets and become cautious about expansion, growth slows, hiring slows, wages stagnate. The geopolitical dimension is even more concerning. Europe's strategy depended on economic coercion being effective. If that tool is damaged, what replaces it? Europe's military capacity is limited and fragmented. Diplomatic pressure works when backed by economic leverage. Without it, protests are ignored. China is the only unambiguous winner. Russian market share, yuan as alternative currency, alternative financial infrastructure, and they demonstrated to the global south that partnership with China provides protection from Western financial coercion. The Belt and Road Initiative just got new life. China can now offer countries not just infrastructure investment, but financial independence from Western systems. For nations that feel Western conditions are too intrusive, that's appealing. Russia's calculations throughout this were rational from their perspective. Yes, they lost $105 billion, but they demonstrated strength, damaged Western credibility, accelerated alternative system development, and imposed costs on European corporations that far exceeded their losses. From a purely strategic standpoint, they won the exchange. And they're not done. Russia has started hinting at additional retaliatory measures if European countries seize more Russian assets. What those measures might be isn't specified, but the threat is clear. Europe opened a door to economic warfare they can't control the consequences of. Some European policymakers are privately admitting the seizure was a mistake, not publicly. Public admission would be political suicide. But in closed meetings, they acknowledge the costs exceeded benefits. The problem is there's no way to reverse it. The assets are gone, the precedent is set, the damage is done. The only question now is how far the erosion of euro credibility goes. Best case scenario, it stabilizes at a new lower level of trust. The euro remains a reserve currency, but a diminished one. Worst case scenario, this is the beginning of a spiral where reduced confidence leads to capital flight, leads to higher borrowing costs, leads to economic weakness, leads to more reduced confidence. The European Union was built on economic integration as a path to peace and prosperity. The irony is that weaponizing the very financial integration that was supposed to prevent conflict might end up destroying the prosperity that made integration possible. If European economies struggle because their financial systems lost credibility, the political stresses that follow could threaten the Union itself. We're watching the real-time demonstration of why financial systems depend on credibility above all else. The euro isn't backed by gold or commodities.
You have heard all about DeepSeek, the Chinese artificial intelligence AI company, which this week changed the global AI landscape. Not to mention the $1 trillion losses it caused in the New York Stock Exchange and Nasdaq. DeepSeek is China's response to OpenAI's ChatGPT-4. Its models perform as efficiently as their American counterparts. The difference is that DeepSeek is offered to you, to everyone, for free. How do they make money? Only by selling services to developers, and that compared to OpenAI's services, GPT-4, 5, at a fraction of OpenAI's prices. The gist of DeepSeek's arrival on the AI scene and the carnage in the American stock exchanges is a sudden transition from proprietary to open source technology. It is therefore no great wonder that the moment DeepSeek became the most downloaded app on the Apple Store, it pulverized the market capitalization of the hitherto overinflated US big tech stocks. But how did this happen exactly? How is it that a private commodified service is suddenly offered for free? And does this mean that techno-feudalism is in trouble? To begin with, it's important to note that AI was never a proprietary technology in itself. The underlying code of all AI companies was always open source. What made American AI a quasi-private commodity was the way in which these models were trained using huge amounts of privatized data. Where I say privatized, you should translate